Monday, August 9th, 2026, and we left off on Genesis 19. 19. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Actually, give me a second. Oh, it's too hot. Okay. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth and said, "My lords, please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise up early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the town square." But he pressed them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Lot went out to the men at the entrance and shut the door after him and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have two daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you." Wait. But they said, okay, the crowd said, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and drew near to break the door down. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the entrance of the house, both small and great, so that they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Okay, so, geez. So this wicked crowd approaches Lot and says, "Bring those dudes out so we can have sex with them." And Lot says, "Please don't do that, but here I offer you my virgin daughters instead." That's pretty crazy. And presumably he does not know what's going on. So it's interesting that he would say that. Even if we're to assume that he knew that these two, because these two are angels, as we read yesterday, that's still pretty wild for him to do. But let's keep reading and then we'll ask about it. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here, sons-in-laws, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." Man, there's a lot of good stuff here. So does that mean there's listening to the dead, like those that have died here? So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered, so the men seized him and his wife and his two daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. escape to the hills, lest you be swept away. And Lot said to them, Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest the disaster overtake me, and I die. Behold, this city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one, and my life will be saved? He said to him, Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there. Therefore the name of the city was called Zoar. All right, so that's verse 22. Let's back up. This is really wild. So the angels go down to Sodom, and God told them, even if you find 10 people that are righteous in the entire city, I will spare it. And then God stayed behind, or at least God manifest in a man, or Christ perhaps, we're not sure. But either God or Christ, pre-incarnate Christ, stayed behind to talk to Abraham. The angels went down to Sodom. They encounter Lot. They get to Sodom. He tells them to come into the house, his house. And while they're there, the wicked crowd comes and says, bring out those 2 dudes that we saw go in your house so we can have sex with them. And Lot says, no, how about instead you take my 2 virgin daughters? And they didn't accept. But the fact that he made the offer is what I want to ask the question about. Because why? I just, that's hard to grip with. So let's see. What do the theologians say about this encounter? It seems very strange that Lot would make an offer of his virgin daughters, whether they were virgins or not, to please the crowd in order to save the men. And even if he knew they were angels or not, it still seems like perhaps his character could be called into question for even making the offer. Am I missing something here? Other than God is extremely graceful and merciful. Because he still spared his life and saved him. No, you're not missing something obvious. No, you're not missing something obvious. Lot's offer of his daughters in Genesis 19:8 is supposed to disturb us. A very common conclusion among Jewish and Christian interpreters is that the narrative does not present that offer as morally acceptable simply because Lot is, in some sense, the more righteous person in Sodom. The interesting theological question is why Genesis includes this awful detail. So first, the text never says God approved of Lot's offer. No, it did not. This is probably the most important starting point. Genesis reports Lot saying, Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. In other words, they're virgins. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. But the narrator never says Lot did what was right, and the angels certainly don't accept the proposal. In fact, they intervene, pull Lot back inside, and protect the household themselves. Yeah, and the men denied it anyway. Yeah, that distinction matters throughout Genesis. Description is not endorsement. Yeah, of course, that's not what I'm saying. But still, biblical narratives routinely tell us about reprehensible actions by significant figures without stopping to insert an explicit moral judgment every time. And Lot is already a deliberately complicated character by Genesis 19. Number 2, ancient hospitality explains his reasoning but doesn't justify it. This is where historical context helps, although sometimes commentators push it too far. In the ancient Near East, receiving someone under the shelter of my roof created a very serious obligation of hospitality and protection. Lot explicitly appeals to that obligation. He says, "Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Snap, I'm making y'all read blind. My bad. Hold on one sec. I was staring right at it and it didn't even register. It should pop up here in a sec. Okay, there we go. My bad. I'm sitting here staring at the cable, not even plugged in. Okay, so we can understand. Wait, let me go back. Lot explicitly appeals to that obligation. "Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." So we can understand his thought process. He says, his reasoning is, "I have taken these strangers into my home, therefore I am responsible for protecting them at virtually any cost." But explaining Lot's moral framework is not the same thing as approving it. His solution is grotesquely disordered. To prevent the sexual violation of his male guest, he proposes the sexual violation of his own daughters. Yeah. Man, that's intense. Many interpreters, therefore, see the passage as showing both something commendable and something deeply corrupt in Lot simultaneously. He recognizes his duty toward vulnerable strangers and courageously confronts a violent mob, but his proposed means of protecting them is morally horrifying. It's true. It's transparent, if nothing else. I mean, that's very human. Lot, number 3, Lot may be intentionally portrayed as compromised by Sodom. This reading becomes especially compelling when you look at Lot's whole story. Earlier, Lot chooses the Jordan Valley because it is prosperous and eventually settles in Sodom. Oh, that's right, because Abraham gave him the choice, and he chose the Jordan Valley and then settled in Sodom because they had to split ways because they'd both become so wealthy and there's plenty of land, so they decided to split up because their people were starting to disagree and fight. There was infighting. Genesis immediately warns us, "Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord." It's Genesis 13:13. By chapter 19, Lot isn't merely camping nearby, he's sitting in the gate of Sodom, an expression often associated with participation in the civic life of a city. I see. So they're implying some corruption had started to creep in, perhaps, but he still had not completely lost his way. So him sitting at the gate and not living in town square, perhaps being a metaphor for his how deeply he'd become involved. So partially corrupt, not fully. So one major theological reading is that Lot has lived in Sodom long enough that his moral instincts have become badly distorted. He knows the mob's intended act is wicked. He explicitly calls it wicked in verse 7. But his alternative reveals how compromised his own moral judgment has become. That makes Lot fascinating because Scripture later calls him righteous Lot in 2 Peter. Lot is described as a righteous man distressed by the lawless behavior surrounding him. Which it's hard to not turn up your nose at this, but even if by your own measure, like me reading this personally, you reading this personally to yourself, we're still not sinless. So I don't know, these things become not difficult to read like pearl clutching, but it's almost humbling because you know that you just as well, me just as well, have sinned. So it's not like we can sit here and judge. And we're not supposed to, but yeah, nonetheless, it's an intense example of moral compromise. And then the fact that he's still called righteous, which is also pretty wild. Those two things aren't necessarily contradictory. Lot can belong to God and genuinely hate Sodom's wickedness while still being a deeply flawed man whose moral judgment has been damaged. Which speaks to the fact that, I mean, even if you deeply love God and you do your best to follow God, you could potentially make choices that permanently traumatize and harm people that you love, and his daughters in this case. I mean, he was willing to do that. But that's real life. Number 4, there is an especially disturbing parallel in Judges, the book of Judges. Genesis 19 has an unmistakable literary cousin in Judges 19. A Levite and his concubine are given hospitality in Gibeah. Men surround the house and demand that the male guest be handed over for sexual abuse. The host responds by offering his virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead. The concubine ultimately is handed over, gang raped throughout the night, and dies. My gosh. That story is intentionally horrifying. Judges uses it to demonstrate just how morally ruined Israel has become. Sheesh. And the parallels with Genesis 19 are so strong that most interpreters think Judges deliberately wants readers to remember Sodom. The shocking point is essentially Israel has become like Sodom. That comparison makes it especially difficult to argue that offering the women is somehow being presented as morally good behavior. In Judges, the corresponding act forms part of one of the Bible's strongest depictions of human depravity. Number 5, did Lot know they were angels? Which this is kind of beside the fact, but interesting to expound on. Probably not at first. Genesis 19:1 tells us, the readers, that the two angels came to Sodom, but Lot addresses them as Adonai, meaning my lords, and treats them as travelers needing lodging. Let's see. Let's read this one. Number 6. There is also an ancient interpretation that is extremely hard on Lot. Your instinct about his character has quite old precedent. Some early Jewish interpreters sharply condemned Lot for this, and among Christian theologians, Augustine of Hippo wrestled with passages like this using the principle that one must not commit one evil in order to prevent another. Likewise, later Christian moral theology generally does not permit Lot's logic. I can allow an innocent person to be sexually assaulted if doing so prevents another grave evil. The end doesn't make the means righteous. There have also been interpreters who tried to soften Lot's proposal, for example, suggesting that he knew the mob wouldn't accept women or that the offer was rhetorical, but that is speculative. Nothing in Genesis actually tells us that. The straightforward reading is much uglier. Lot really offers them. And number 7, there's a remarkable irony in what happens immediately afterward. This is one of the details that makes me think Genesis wants us to have serious reservations about Lot. Lot says, essentially, take my daughters, but don't violate my guest. The angels don't permit either thing to happen. They rescue Lot. Yet after Sodom's destruction, Genesis 19 ends with Lot becoming sexually involved with those very daughters. This time after they intoxicate him. So I guess we're about to read that. Jeez. So the chapter is bookended by profoundly disordered sexuality involving Lot's family. Lot is not presented as some spotless hero standing against wicked Sodom. The distinction is subtler and considerably darker. God rescues Lot from Sodom, but there is something of Sodom in Lot's family already. And notice another uncomfortable detail. When the angels tell Lot to flee, Lot hesitates. It did say that, but he lingered. The angels actually have to seize Lot, his wife, and his daughters by the hands and physically lead them out. Then Genesis gives the theological reason: the Lord was being merciful to him. The emphasis isn't ultimately, look how excellent Lot was, and therefore God saved him, but instead, look how merciful God was to Lot, despite his obvious flaws. And that helps explain why Scripture can call Lot righteous. So righteous in 2 Peter doesn't require us to conclude that every action Lot takes in Genesis 19 is righteous. The Bible does this with other major figures too. Noah gets drunk, Abraham deceives people concerning Sarah and puts her in serious jeopardy. Jacob deceives, David commits adultery and arranges a man's death. Peter denies Jesus. Biblical narrative is remarkably willing to give us saints without sanitizing them. That's a good question. So if your reaction to reading this is, even if Lot is trying to protect his guest, offering his daughters is appalling, doesn't this say something seriously troubling about Lot himself? And the obvious answer is yes. The historical background explains why Lot might have thought this way, but it doesn't transform the offer, and it's not trying to present it as morally acceptable either. It's just what happened. Dang. All right. Well, okay. So let's go back. Verse 23. So they have fled at this point. Had fled. Is that the past tense of flee? They've left at this point. They've escaped to this small city called Zoar. Verse 23, the sun had risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the alley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. So earlier the angels told him, don't look back. She didn't listen. She looked back. She became a pillar of salt. She's dead. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. So now we're back to Abraham. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, at least the body that he was using to present himself as a man to Abraham, because there was 3 visitors initially. 2 were angels and 1 was God or Jesus, depending on your interpretation. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley, and he looked, and behold, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had lived. Now Lot went up out of Zoar, the town he escaped to, and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters. For he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, my gosh. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. My gosh. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know when she lay down or when she arose. So Lot didn't know. So his daughter raped him. If he did know, I guess by definition, geez. Okay, so he did not know when she had sex with him involuntarily or when she was done. And the next day, the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. So he didn't know, and he impregnated both of his daughters. That's a tough read. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Man. Genesis 20, verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned. Well, hold on. Okay, so so we kind of see a recurring theme. I don't know if I want to call it a theme. I don't know, but obviously we understand. Speaking for you guys, speaking for myself, I understand that by the Bible including these things, it's not saying that these things are morally acceptable. So I mean, that's clear to me. Hopefully that's clear to everybody. But I just think it's really interesting, the thinking behind why, or maybe it's not that interesting. I don't know. I don't even know what I want to break down about it. I just think it's kind of wild. But I suppose, well, actually, maybe I will. Okay, actually, I do have a question. I think it's a reasonable question. So when something like this happens, right? So God saved Lot. He chose, and obviously God knew what Lot had done, and presumably, and when I say what he had done, meaning he offered up his virgin daughters to a violent and sexually depraved crowd. And presumably Lot had done, he had sinned before that. That wasn't his only sin in his entire life. We can almost guarantee that. But he saved him nonetheless, as he saves us. And we are not perfect. So that's not really the point. But my question now is, would something, well, let me just ask it and then I'll explain myself as I ask it. We know that God was merciful to Lot and saved him, even though he offered up his virgin daughters to a sexually depraved and violent crowd. My question is, although the Bible doesn't explicitly say, but what would theologians say about the question of whether or not the daughter's actions, how would they be seen in God's eyes? Presumably, would they go to hell for such actions, or I don't even know what else. I don't even know what else to say about it. I'm just curious more than anything at this point. Yes, the distinction you're making is important. Most Christian theologians would regard what Lot's daughters did in Genesis as gravely sinful, but they would not conclude from the passages that the daughters therefore went to hell. Scripture simply does not tell us their ultimate fate. There are actually several layers to what is happening in that rather grim chapter. So how would their actions be viewed? The daughters deliberately intoxicate their father and have sex with him without his meaningful knowledge or consent. From the standpoint of later biblical sexual ethics, the incest itself is prohibited in Leviticus, which we haven't got to yet. And the deception and exploitation of an incapacitated person compound the wrongdoing. And Genesis doesn't need to say, and this was evil in the sight of the Lord, for the narrative to condemn it, which we've already talked through that part, so we get that. Biblical narrative frequently reports horrific behavior without inserting an explicit moral verdict after every event. The grotesqueness of the episode and the consequences that flow from it are part of the judgment. Let's see. Yeah, it doesn't really take a hard stance, and I think that's fair because the scripture doesn't say, and we just can't really know. And so it's just one of those things. All right, let's just go on. So, yeah, okay. Genesis 20, verse 1. Excuse me. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." So he's back to doing this again. He's lying again about his wife being his sister. He did not learn his lesson. Okay, and Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So twice he's done this. That's crazy. Which I suppose, so God never, it's interesting because the first time he did it with the Pharaoh, God had just told him that he will make great nations of him and he's going to bless him. But in order to protect, he was worried for his life that if the Pharaoh saw his beautiful wife at the time, she's old now, but at the time he was worried that since his wife was so beautiful, they would kill him for being her husband and Pharaoh would just take her for himself. So instead he says, "Tell the Pharaoh that you're my sister." So she did. The Pharaoh took her anyway for his wife. But since he thought Abraham was her brother, he followed tradition and gave him a bunch of wealth and gifts in exchange for taking his quote-unquote sister as a wife. So through deception, he gained all of this wealth, but gave up his wife in the process, and then later got her back and got to leave with all of the wealth anyway, because he had God's favor. And so the question at the time was, like, why? Because God never said anything about God punishing him or pressing him about the fact that he was deceptive in that way. It didn't say anything about it. Although the deception is acknowledged and most agree that that doesn't mean it's okay. It's just what he decided to do, but God still didn't go back on his word. Now, years later, they're old now. So presumably, actually, that's the question. Okay, so presumably this would not still be necessary because they're old now, but he does it again. So let's ask about that. In Genesis, twice Abraham, or rather, this is the second time I've come across Abraham lying about Sarah being his sister instead of being honest and saying that that is his wife. The first time, we can at least understand the reasoning because she was very beautiful when they were younger, and he didn't want to be killed by the Pharaoh, so they lied and said that she was his sister, and he gained great wealth and eventually got to walk away with that wealth because he had God's favor, but he had to give up his wife for a time. From what I recall, Scripture never condemned him directly for the deception, although I think most interpretations of the Scripture would agree that that was deception and wouldn't necessarily be pleasing to God. However, the second time he does this, what do the theologians say about this instance? Because now it's happening when they are much older. And so what would be the logic here if Sarah, by this point, would have lost her beauty and presumably would not be drawing the same kind of envy to the point where Abraham's life would be in danger? It's like the longest question ever, but in Genesis 20 is actually more unsettling than the first episode, precisely because Abraham is older, has already experienced God's protection, and has just received the explicit promise that Sarah herself will bear the covenant son. The repetition seems very deliberate. One small correction to the premise, though: Genesis does not portray the elderly Sarah as having necessarily lost her beauty. That's true. I'm making an assumption that that would have been lost. Maybe back then they weren't aging the same way. It does say that Moses, when he died, I think he was 120, but that he had all the vigor of his youth. So I don't know, maybe perhaps back then you didn't get old and gray. You just, I guess, just killed over when you were old, but you didn't suffer the same kind of like physical attrition that we do now. Anyway, she is about 80 to 90 at this point, which makes Abimelech taking her surprising to modern readers. Ancient commentators and modern scholars have proposed several explanations. Sarah may still have been remarkably attractive. Abimelech's actions may have had political or dynastic motives rather than simply sexual attraction. Or the narrator may simply expect us to accept that she remained desirable. The text itself never tells us why Abimelech wanted her. More importantly, Genesis eventually tells us exactly why Abraham repeats the lie. Oh, okay, so we get an explanation at this point. When Abimelech confronts him, Abraham says, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." So, yeah, okay, so he says it. So it's the exact same reasoning that he had before. And presumably, I guess you could say, since, and maybe this is a fault of ours, or we're meant to interpret it that way, is that without discipline, we don't really learn. So God didn't discipline Abraham for this, and so he does it again. I don't know if that's to speak to our nature or what. We'll ask about that. So anyway, so Abraham's reasoning is essentially the same as in Egypt: fear for his life. Then comes a fascinating detail. Genesis 20:12 says, "Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." So Abraham wasn't technically inventing the sibling relationship. Sarah was his half-sister. The deception was in concealing the crucial part of the truth: she is also my wife. And then verse 13 reveals something even more important. "And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do to me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.'" So he'd already instructed her everywhere they go. So yeah, so I guess he always had this innate fear with him. That means this wasn't an improvised lie Abraham came up with twice. It was a standing policy Abraham and Sarah had established when they first began wandering. That changes how I read the chapter, how ChatGPT reads the chapter. Genesis 20 isn't necessarily saying Sarah was so beautiful at age 90 that Abraham suddenly became afraid again. Abraham is saying essentially, this is the survival strategy we've been using whenever we are outsiders in potentially hostile territory. And yes, theologians generally see Abraham as being in the wrong. Let's see. You're also noticing something important about the narrator's style. Genesis rarely stops and says Abraham sinned by doing X. Biblical narrative often gives its moral evaluation through consequences, irony, dialogue, and contrast, rather than explicit editorial commentary. Genesis 20 is particularly brutal toward Abraham in that respect. Abraham assumes there is no fear of God in this place, yet who behaves with greater moral integrity in the story? Abimelech, just like Pharaoh. So God himself tells Abimelech, yes, I know you have done this in the integrity of your heart. Okay, so we'll go back. Let's just read that because that's interesting. So I don't want to read the whole thing through the chat's interpretation, but I do want to ask one question. I have an additional question. In all of these instances where Abraham was giving his wife to Abimelech and Pharaoh, in the instances we see, are we to assume that she was also sleeping with them, and that was just something they understood that they would both have to deal with? No, and this is an important distinction between the two stories. Genesis does not give us grounds to assume Sarah slept with either Pharaoh or Abimelech. Well, that's interesting. In the Abimelech episode, it explicitly tells us that she did not. With Pharaoh, the text is less explicit, so we simply don't know. But with Abimelech, it was explicitly no. That's interesting. Okay, so then let's go back then. So let's just read it. So, all right, so verse 2. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man. Oh my gosh. He says, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now, okay, so this is pretty crazy. So this is yeah, God was active in Genesis. He was not using a lot of proxies. He was just doing it himself. Verse 4, now Abimelech had not approached her, so they didn't have sex. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. So this is interesting too, because this kind of tells us, because we didn't, well, I don't know if you can say that really, but this, the fact that it's direct or addressed directly here and not the first time with Pharaoh kind of tells me, at least in my interpretation, that she probably did have sex with Pharaoh, but perhaps at the time she was barren. But now, since she's no longer barren, perhaps that's why God is now stepping in. I don't know, but that's how I'm going to choose to interpret that. Okay, so then God said to him, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Man. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father. So I'm not going to lie. Abraham seemed just kind of like a slime. I mean, God obviously loved him very much, but I mean, that's just kind of skeevy. But you know what? I suppose I shouldn't pass judgment. But man, okay. Anyway, he says, besides, she is. So I just imagine him saying, like, you know, technically, besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do to me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham, so just like Pharaoh, and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So if nothing else, I think it speaks to, like, why is this, like, twice this happens? So obviously it's a pattern that's intentional, and God still continues to, like, he's on Abraham's side here. This is not, there's still no reprimand of what Abraham is doing. So perhaps it's meant to serve as a very prominent example that if God gives you a promise, gives us a promise, and he did, Jesus Christ, he's going to keep it despite repeated obvious sins, which is everybody, us, all of us, which is comforting in a way. Instead of me like looking now, I'm trying to think, actually, Lord forgive me, I shouldn't have talked about Abraham in that way, because I'm certainly not perfect. But if anything, that's what I think it's trying to tell us, is that God doesn't break his promises, even though Abraham is doing these things openly and repeatedly, and it was planned, no less. It wasn't also, this is not some kind of on the spot kind of lie twice. This was a choice by he and Sarah to lie about their marriage to everybody as they wondered. Man, okay, so Genesis 21. Actually, that's probably a good stopping point. Yeah, it's probably a good place to stop for the night. So we'll pick it up tomorrow on Genesis 21, verse 1. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to drop a sub, share it with a friend. God bless you guys, and good night. Genesis has been really good, by the way. This is I don't want to say I enjoy I mean, I was going to say it's a lot darker than I expected. But also the transparency is appreciated, but also very unnerving, but in a very human way. I mean, what can we say? This is all of us to some degree, right?